This video of Theology Bits is created by Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. These last 6 weeks, we have gone through a study of civic life and faith, and this video provides an introduction to one of the concepts in that study, Luther's Two Kingdoms theology as it relates to a democracy. Luther's Two Kingdoms theology is really built on the idea that God rules over the whole of the world. And God's reign, or kingdom, another word for reign, can be expressed in two ways. There is the kingdom of the right hand and the kingdom of the left hand. And Martin Luther talked about the kingdom of the right hand as the way God rules in the way we would kind of expect. For example, the way God works in the human heart, or the way in which in Lutheran theology we call justification and sanctification. How a believer is made right with God, having been justified by the work of Jesus, and how that grace they've received now plays itself out into daily life, or a sanctified life. Might call it as grace and works. These are fundamentally individual actions. How God is working with an individual believer in a particular time and place. This is how we usually imagine God working in the world. That is, if God wants something to happen, convicts in the heart that leads to a justified life and thereby works in this world. But Luther believed that God also works in what he called the kingdom of the left hand. And the kingdom of the left hand is built on the human institutions that are present in daily life. And Luther called these things three estates. And the estates were of the church, of the government, and what he called the household. We would call this much more than the household. We would call it every aspect of daily life, including business and employment. And here, by the church, he means the established church on earth, which is an institution. And in these estates, Luther wanted to make very clear that God is indeed working, that God is acting in this way. That is, there was a variety of means by which God works, some of which are expressed in these different spaces. These are, rather than individual, these are societal. And society provides within them roles for individual people, individual spaces. Some are quite built on spirituality, some not at all. They're simply things society has created. In our study, we have been looking at the way in which these relate with one another, and it's really a semi-permeable boundary. That is how our justification, sanctification is played out in the world, because our individual calling is expressed in societal roles. Of course, if we're going to act, where do we act but simply the kingdom of the left, which leads for Luther to a fundamental tension. And that tension is, if God is working through these means of human institutions, does that mean these human institutions are established by God, as in, say, Romans 13? Or are they fallible human institutions? Well, this became a major question and something that Luther continually returns to. And one of the primary ones for our study on civic life had to do with the estate of the government. Has God established the government, and by this he meant every government, or is it a fallible human institution that can be challenged? In essence, the tension, and it is fundamentally a tension, is established of, can you challenge a government system, or do you simply have to work within that system? And Luther comes to different spaces at different times. Later in his life, after the Peasants' Revolt, he becomes more and more skeptical of challenging that system. Today, though, we don't live in the kind of society Luther lived in. We live in a democracy. This is a concept Luther knew nothing about. He lived in a medieval world that had kings and princes and that felt very established, even if they were fallible, that to work within the system was not to challenge it in almost any way, but simply follow the regent that you have. In a democracy, though, we have a new space because our active participation is part of working within the system, allows new freedom. And within this freedom is the freedom to be able to challenge it. So for Luther, what became a fundamental tension for us, in America at least, is far less of a tension. That part of working within the system is the freedom to change it and to be able to get into new spaces. And so in civic life and faith, we expect that the normal tension here between our individual calling and how that can play into roles in society, which may not be a incredibly spiritual activity, this tension is played out, but is given new freedom to act forward. And so one question we have that Luther did not have is, how does the estate of the church and the household relate with each other, and especially with government? Well, in America, churches, the estate of the church, institutions of churches, are normally 501c3 nonprofits, and so therefore they cannot endorse a political candidate or a political party. However, that does not mean that they have no role in what is going on in government. A separation of church and state does not require a complete separation so that the church could have no space to speak or to frame in government, nor, by the way, the household or business affairs. And what's more, we expect that one's in the kingdom of the right, the way God rules in our hearts, is going to inform all three of these estates. And so we do have new space and new freedom. And so this has led in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America to think of our institutional church and churches as a community of moral discernment. Because moral discernment is, what do we do when this fundamental tension arise, not because we're not sure whether we should challenge or whether we should work within the system, but simply, what is it we should be doing? Where is that freedom to be expressed? Because so many times we are dealing with questions of ambiguity. Ambiguity is based on those things we don't know exactly what to do. Even if we have a firm principle and a firm stance, how do we apply that stance? And here we are given space for creativity. Just as all callings have space for creativity in how they play out in societal roles, so does that apply into the world of the church and the government. Where and what can we be doing? Do we have the freedom to simply try things? How do we come together and discern as a group how we fit within a committee? Always coming back to this fundamental theology that it is indeed God who is working in both spaces through various means, some of which seem overtly spiritual and some that really do not. This has been an overview and an introduction to Luther's two kingdoms theology and how that can be expressed in a democracy. Thank you. I'm Pastor Ben.